In this episode with Todd Muller.
You know, these have these challenges as well, right? The more you are put up on a pedestal by your family and friends and sense that actually you have a destiny, I think the risk of hubris becomes extreme. And so, and I've navigated that myself. But I'm not deeply partisan, and I'm not tribally partisan, and I see more of that actually in politics today than I did back then, and certainly even in the last 10 years. And more of it is fueled, I think, by younger and younger people are wanting to get involved in politics who have not necessarily, had the life experience. That's a broad statement. Of course, there's many, many exceptions to counter that view. But I think experience, lived experience, is important if you want to be a representative of a community. But I guess one of the big lessons from those leadership roles is the power of promoting people to your management team who are better than you. And I know it's a very trite thing to say, but actually we like to think we do that, but often those words are betrayed by our actions, and actually we tend to appoint people that make us comfortable, that reflect our personalities, reflect our capability and competencies, and are essentially mirror images to an extent of ourselves, right? I have been through the fire, but there's a lot to be thankful for, and it has changed me as a person. I think I am more empathetic. I always thought I was empathetic, but it's like anything, right? You don't truly understand unless you've lived it. It's not a criticism. It's just now when you meet people that have had challenges in terms of, and are having challenges in terms of mental health, there's a relatability and an understanding and a connection that otherwise wouldn't have been there. And that's a powerful thing, to have that, be able to have those connections with people, and in a small way, maybe, assist in being someone that they feel that they can talk to about. So it's absolutely changed my life, and bizarrely in a good way. And you're talking legacy, right? It's not for me to define it, but I suspect it'll be more related to this experience than any other thing that I did in the 9 years that I was there. And that's pretty powerful.
Todd, thank you for being here today. Appreciate you giving up some time to come and talk to us about your life's work. And that's a nice segue into my first question. How would you describe what your life's work is?
Yeah, I think I would describe it very much through the lens of people and service and the agricultural sectors. They have been the real driver of my professional career over the last 30 years. Was a real fascination on agricultural exports, how that happened in this country, with a real understandable connection with kiwi fruit, because that's been my family's history. So agriculture first, love of that, then went to university, fell in love with politics, and the sort of fusion of horticulture, kiwi fruit, the wider agriculture sector, how we make our way in the world, being able to connect growers in particular with the challenges and opportunities that exist offshore with their particular product, and over time that widening to having a political career. But sort of the connection with people and trying to assist their understanding of their purpose has been a big part of my life's work.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. My next line of questioning is going to go back to your childhood. You mentioned that horticulture has been a big part of your family's history. So can you talk to us a bit about your childhood, growing up, and your family unit, what that was like, and you know, what was Todd like as a young fellow, character-wise? You know, what were you about back then?
Well, I'll start with the family. So I'm the eldest of 4 boys. My mum was the only child of Henry and Eileen Skidmore, who were mayor and mayoress of Te Araha, lived in Te Araha for most of their life. The reason I mention them is they have a huge impact on me as I grew up. I can't recall my father's parents. His mother died when he was young, when he was about 18, and his father died when I was 5. So my mum and dad were dairy farmers. Firstly in Alstow, just out of Te Araha. Then they went to my grandfather's farm up in Pukekohe, or Drury, just south of Pukekohe. And that's my first childhood memories, is being on that farm. I can remember being in a Vanguard ute with Dad, like it was yesterday. It broke down at the back of the farm, and he put me on a pillow or a cushion that he found from somewhere, and I just had to keep the car or the ute straight as he towed it back up the farm and up the road. I mean, the idea of doing that in 2023 just seems extraordinary, but I know it does happen in rural New Zealand. But I can remember that like yesterday. And then when I was 5, my parents decided to leave dairy, and they bought a Chinese gooseberry orchard in Te Puna, just north of here. And that has been my childhood home. In fact, Mum's just sold it and moved into Bethlehem. So we had it for 50 years. And so kiwi fruit and my parents' role in growing it, packing it. We had a little pack house, and eventually a larger pack house and cool store in Apata. That was my life growing up. My father was very much in the service side of the industry. He was the first to create a calibrated spraying business. So as kiwi fruit took off in the 70s and early 80s, he provided spraying services. It's how I got my way through university, was spraying kiwi fruit. So kiwi fruit and living on that orchard was a massive part of my life. And then frankly, every second weekend, we'd drive over to Te Araha to see my grandparents. And as you can imagine, they had their one daughter who produced 4 sons, and we were the complete apple of their eye, right? And so we were treated like kings when we went to Te Araha, and I'm sure that rubbed off on our personalities. But in terms of what I was like, very talkative, quite shy, out of the home, but in our home and our orchard and in our family base, was very talkative, probably quite bossy if you ask my 3 younger brothers, and even from an early age had an absolute fascination in reading and history, but very much, I was at my best when I was at home, quite a homeboy, didn't particularly like being out of home, didn't particularly enjoy doing things that weren't within my comfort zone. I just loved being at home. And of course, being the boss meant that we could play rugby how I wanted it, which largely meant we won, play cricket how I wanted it, which largely meant we won. So why would you want to leave Te Puna and an orchard and a great big playing area out the front when you could always win in every game. It was great fun.
Yeah. So when you talked there about being shy and a homeboy, what were you like at school, for instance? How did that pan out for you at school?
I had a couple of close friends, one of whom I'm still very close with. He was my best man at my wedding, so I love that about life. How Hamish turned up, I think, when I was 10, and we're still very close 43 years later. I was talkative, certainly quite talkative at school, but quite tentative would be the word that I would. I wasn't particularly sporty, and still aren't. And so whenever there was something new, I would rather not put myself forward. I was quite tentative and shy socially, certainly not confident in, as you see these kids nowadays, and they just blow my mind, frankly, how articulate they are, right? They can stand up in front of their classroom, and even at a young age, they're learning they'll be able to do a mihi, they can stand up and get a little speech. Well, that would have terrified me. The ability to stand up and speak was not something that came to me until I was much older. That time in my life, you would never have imagined that I would, could evolve into somebody that perhaps have a leadership role in anything. I was really tentative, shy, a little bit talkative, but not someone that would stand out.
It's interesting, like you say, about the sort of leadership side of things, because I think we automatically assume, don't we, that the leaders are the biggest, loudest, but it's not necessarily the case. And as I think Jim Collins wrote in his book, Good to Great, that some of the better leaders are actually the quiet ones and the more sort of retiring from the front side of things.
I strongly agree with that. I think leadership generally, I think we have a predetermined view in our heads as to what leadership looks like. And leadership is the boss. Leadership is the loudest. Obviously in a political context, leadership is the most adept at articulating a particular political view or criticising it if you're in opposition. And so the idea of a servant leader or someone that is a reflective and thoughtful leader, people, that's not a natural combination for people. It's not a natural instinct. And I like the fact that people are starting to reassess some of that sort of historical narrative, frankly, because I think, ultimately we're all leaders in a sense because we can control the most important person, which is ourselves. And I think we can, we can grow, definitely. We all grow in our own understanding of our own capacity and how best to drive that. And that is, by definition, leadership. And then it's how you interconnect in a positive way with others in your either personal home environment or your professional environment. And so I think we all have leadership capacity and leadership credentials and leadership contribution. It's just understandably in modern business and society, there is a hierarchy that defaults to different styles of leadership. And I've often reflected on that because I can visually see myself as a young fella. And certainly when I was at primary school, and not really until secondary school, did I ever imagine myself as being someone that could be a leader. That did changed in my early teens when I had this overwhelming sense that I was going to be a politician and a leader one day. And, that's been a big part of my trajectory ever since.
So I'm liking where this is going on the leadership side of things, and we'll continue with that if we can. I think I saw an interview where you once said that as a young fellow, you wanted to be the Prime Minister of the United States?
President.
Oh, President, sorry. President, yeah. President.
Yeah.
Where
Equally
did that come from?
So-
Because you said you didn't really have leadership aspirations
No,
until a
none
bit
at all.
later, but obviously as a child, you fancied that job.
Well, you see, this is exactly. So if you had seen me, you would have seen a quiet, shy, bubbly at home, quiet, home game pretty raucous, away game, pretty quiet, right? One day, a travelling salesman comes knocking on the door. Mum and Dad get convinced to buy the 1979 version of the World Book Encyclopedias. Pre-Google, that was the only way you could get access to information was going to a library and getting the book out or getting an encyclopedia type series. My parents bought the World Book ones, were for quite a significant, basically Mum said it used up all her housekeeping money. So, in today's money, it was probably thousands of dollars, right? And I fell in love with these. So much so that Mum, as she's moved from Te Puna into Bethlehem, has suggested that I have them, and they're now sort of my bookcase. And leather bound, and of course, everything that you could think of was, in these encyclopedias, including remarkable profiles on the presidents of the United States, their pictures, their signatures, those who preceded them, little caricatures, 2 caricatures of those who succeeded them, and then their life story. And I read these. I just became absolutely passionate, borderline obsessed with these profiles of the American presidents that were in the American World Book Encyclopedia. I drew pictures of them. I copied their signatures. And then by about the age of 11, I think, I decided to write a story as to what my life would be in the future. We've still got it. It's about, I sort of ran out of puff after 3 pages, but it's not bad as an 11-year-old. But you can't fault the imagination or the ambition, because I went to America when I was about 19, as I imagined, became very successful in American politics to the extent that I became vice president by the age of 28. Which is a constitutional impediment that I hadn't quite got my head around, but putting that aside. And then, of course, as you would expect with a young fella, the president was something terrible befell him. And I became president and then went on to serve 13 consecutive terms, which is constitutional impediment number 2. So I have this book at home, or these falling apart sheets of paper now, which has got a self-portrait on the front, and the heading is The Life and Times of Todd Muller, President of the United States, 2001 to 2053. You're like, that's an effort.
Yeah.
And I just loved imagining what that would look like. And so American politics, I just absolutely fell in love with. And so you have this sort of a dichotomy with, this private passion. And then, as Hamish, my best mate, said, you have, in the 4th form or 5th form, you had to do speech competitions, and you did a speech on mice. And he said, it was autobiographical. You're up there shaking and, seriously, I couldn't speak. I had no self-confidence. I don't know what happened between the 5th form and the 6th form, but it started to change. And then by the end of the 7th form, year 13, I came second in the speech competition for the 7th form. But by then I had a real sense that, I absolutely knew that one day I wanted to be a politician. And certainly if I could, Prime Minister. I'd moved from President to Prime Minister by the time I was about 15 and thought, yep, one day I'm going to do this. And it has been my North Star as a profession and as a career ever since. Michelle says, and she recalls that on our first date, after I'd skipped through the sort of preliminary, who are your parents, who are your brothers, sisters, what's your history, then back to me, I want to be a politician, and I can't quite recall it like that. I thought there was slightly more romance in the engagement, But she's adamant that I was very quick to point out that that was a career trajectory that sat in front of me, which, as an aside, and we'll get to it, I'm sure, is a very interesting place for me to be now at 54, deciding to step away and now needing to find another North Star. It's a very exciting but challenging process that I'm in the middle of at the moment. But certainly back then, I was going to be a politician. Even though if you'd looked at me and seen me in action, you would have thought the guy's dreaming.
Yeah, it's interesting, eh? So that was that the power of the influence of those encyclopedias? Those stories?
Absolutely, yeah. So there's a couple of things. There's the power of the encyclopedias, and my grandparents, who were mayor, they had retired now from being mayor and mayoress, but I loved them deeply. I was their eldest grandson. They were very blessed to have a pretty long life. My granddad lived to 90, my grandmother to 87. That essentially took me through to my 30s. So when I was, in my teens, and then when I went to university at Waikato, I'd go to their place to study. And so what I saw was a couple that lived a relatively simple life, but a hugely fulfilled life based on decades of service. Like, everybody knew them. They knew everybody. They had done so much for that community, both of them separately honoured with Queen's Birthday honours over time for their service in Te Araha. And I could see that they had lived a life of huge meaning. They might not have had hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank, but in terms of life experience and connections with people and affection for and from people, their cup was overflowing. And I was deeply touched by that. And so I think that the service ethos came from them. I think also my late father, both my parents, but my late father had a deep, quiet, humble philosophy around service. And I think, you are a child of your experience. Obviously, you bring your own life's work to that, but you are impacted by your lived experience. And I was surrounded by service, and service seen as valuable, but also humble service, particularly in the context of my granddad and my father. So I think you sort of put that as a grounding, plus a love of politics. And I thought, one day I really would love to do that. Couldn't imagine how that would come to be or come to pass, but I just knew it was going to happen.
Yeah. I'd like to take a moment to talk about one of our sponsors. I'm really pleased to announce that we have Sharp New Zealand as a sponsor. And it's great to have Sharp on board because, as a customer, I can speak about their products and services from personal experience. And it feels good to be able to endorse and recommend a company because of the level of satisfaction we have regarding the services they provide. And across my businesses, we've certainly been impressed with the care and collaboration we've experienced in our dealings with Sharp. It's certainly a brand that we trust. Sharp has a long history of creating breakthrough products designed to meet the needs of people living in New Zealand. Sharp's leadership in technology innovation ensures it's at the forefront of the pack, providing business solutions from printing and photocopying to interactive meeting solutions and ICT phone systems. No matter where you are or what size your organisation, whether you're large or small, Sharp New Zealand can provide their services to you nationwide. If you're looking to upgrade your technology or renew your photocopier leases, talk to your local Sharp team or visit the website at sharp.net.nz. I mean, it's great to have that kind of vision, if you like, or ambition at that age, and know exactly what it is you want to do. I mean, I can relate to that. Since the age of 6, I wanted to be Sherlock Holmes. So you wanted to be the president. I wanted to be Sherlock Holmes. The next best thing was join the police. And so I did that. I saw that through. But for me, looking back, it was great to have some clarity about what I wanted and just be aiming for that, and everything kind of aligns with it.
Yeah.
It's quite important, I think. But that's just my personal opinion. So, at that stage, though, what would you have known really about, other than local politics and seeing your grandparents involved in that.
Yeah.
What did you know about politics actually before you got into it? And I'm asking this question because I kind of toyed with the idea at one point of getting into politics, but didn't know anything about it. So I went through a bit of a process and found out a lot more about it, and actually was glad that I didn't go down that path. But I could see that, a lot of people, and I've been writing about this lately as well, that sometimes if we buy a new house or buy a car, we check it out first, we get a feel for it, but we don't always, with a career or a job, we don't get to check that out.
No.
We just end up in it. We think
Yes.
that's what we want, and then we end up in it.
Yes.
So what was your, looking back, what did you know about politics, and was it what you thought it was going to be when you actually got there?
Look, I had no idea about politics in a New Zealand context. I knew more about American politics than I did about New Zealand politics. It was a funny thing, really, because I just had this deep sense that it was going to happen. And I'd had that in my life before. I was watching at the senior prize giving as a fifth former. I watched one of the seventh formers give the speech, the farewell speech from the class of 1984 to the school. And the moment the guy stood up and spoke, I felt this like prickling sensation down the back of my neck. And I said, I'm going to do that in 2 years' time. Now, I seriously could not stand in front of my class at 15 and give a speech. But I absolutely had the sense that that's what I was going to do in 2 years' time. I had no idea how. I didn't then set about making that happen. I just had the sense that it was going to happen. 2 years later, principal said, Todd, you're doing that speech. Never asked for it, never lobbied for it. It just happened, right? And so I had this huge sense of destiny, right? Now that was fueled by my grandparents' utter devotion to me and sense that I was special. And so, these have these challenges as well, right? The more you are put up on a pedestal by your family and friends and sense that actually you have a destiny, I think the risk of hubris becomes extreme. And so, and I've navigated that myself. And so, but at that time in my life, I was absolutely sure that I was going to be a politician. Now, to your question, I didn't know how, I didn't know what being a politician meant. I just knew it in my gut that that's what was going to happen. And so, you go to university. I did management and economics, failed management. Thankfully, didn't matter with Zespri and Fonterra further down the track, but failed management, didn't like it, just got across the line in economics, didn't feel actually that I had much of a future at university. A good friend of mine said, you should go to this US foreign policy paper. It's fantastic. Well, I went in there and I was in heaven, right? Because this was United States foreign policy as directed by the president of the time or in history, and they had interaction with the Russians, the Soviet Union, so I did China policy, Soviet Union foreign policy, US foreign policy, did remarkably well, and that became a master's in social science with a focus on political studies. The politics started in the National Party when I saw a sign, a little notice board in February 1989, which said, all welcome to the Silverdale branch of the Waikato Electorate National Party. So I turned up to that, sat at the back, obviously was the only young guy there, got asked to come to the front, and then a whole lot of serendipitous things happened all at once that just kept happening for the next 30 years. And the first was I made a connection, really deep connection with the electorate chairman of the time. Because I was young, the National Party, had a lot of retired people sitting in that branch. They wanted to have somebody young. It was great. Someone from the next generation's interested in politics. They invited me to the electorate AGM. I turned up to that. I was then invited to say a few words. They then said, why don't you become part of the executive? Why don't you be our young Nat? So that's what happened. They said, why don't you come down to the national conference in 1989? That's what happened. It was in Dunedin. That's where I got to meet Winston Peters for the first time, my local MP, Ruth Richardson, met Jim Bolger, I met Sir Robert Muldoon. That was the first national conference. I have been to, 30 since, and kept doing that. So I became involved in the Young Nats. Then I became student president. I absolutely imagined myself being the student president. No one had been a student president from a young Nat, right? Young Nats don't get elected student presidents. Well, they did in 1991 because there were 4 Labour Party people or left of centre people stood against me because they were so horrified that a young Nat was standing. They split the vote and I won. And on it went. And so at the end of being a student president, I then got a job in the National Party as a regional. The only time they did this was the 1993 election, where they put regional officers that looked after a particular region, which meant that I went round the Central North Island region providing support and advice for the National Party MPs trying to get re-elected. So that threw me in at the very young age of like 21, 22, 23, round there, in the mechanics of running campaigns and how to win them, what to do to try to not to lose them, although we got swept away in most cases because of the swing against the national government in that year. It was remarkable. So I connected with hundreds of people, including my predecessor in this job, Tony Ryle, who was a remarkable politician. And then from there, found myself down in Wellington in 1994. And my job was to be the secretary for the party committee that worked out how to deal with MMP, because we just had the MMP referendum. All our rules had to change. And I was the party person that coordinated that from a operation support perspective. Remarkable experience. And by November 1994, was in the private office of Jim Bolger, the then Prime Minister. Serendipity. And so then I had 3 years travelling around the country, working for him, putting together events every weekend, travelling with him, meeting people from all walks of life, from maraes to schools to hospitals to businesses, from Kaikoui to Stewart Island for 3 years, every weekend, travelling with the Prime Minister. Absolutely extraordinary experience. And so by then, I was absolutely sure that this was going to come to pass, that I was going to be a Member of Parliament. And the question now was when, not if. And then the big decision was to pull out of the political process, the overt, determined political process, and go and do something else for a while.
And why was that? What was the...
I just had a deep... I had a deep sense that if you just kept going in that process, you find yourself an MP by the time you're 30 and you haven't done anything. You have done politics. You have done the process of politics, the sort of the framework of politics. But politics is more than process. Politics is a whole lot more than knowing how to get yourself nominated and get yourself elected and sitting in a caucus. Politics is representing a community. It is understanding people and understanding the diversity of experience, lived experience that is in your community, and giving effect and a voice to it. That's my view of politics. Other people hold a view that politics is partisan, it's ideological, it is your side that must be in ascendancy, because only when you're in government can true progress be made. Of course, I'm a National Party person. I think when National is in government, we do better than when Labor's in government. But I'm not deeply partisan, and I'm not tribally partisan, and I see more of that actually in politics today than I did back then, and certainly even in the last 10 years. And more of it is fueled, I think, by younger and younger people are wanting to get involved in politics who have not necessarily, had the life experience. That's a broad statement. Of course, there's many, many exceptions to counter that view. But I think experience, lived experience, is important if you want to be a representative of a community.
I agree. Did you get advice about that at that age?
No.
Or is that a realization you had yourself?
Instinct, really.
Yeah.
And I thought, look, I'm just too fresh behind the ears here, And people say people are very, I've been hugely supported by the National Party, of the people, the members of the National Party. And they see, and you see, and I see it now as 54, I see it coming in the next generation of absolutely, very talented people that you think, oh, you should be an MP one day. The risk is that you want to get in now. And I think my personal view is that it's better to, live a bit first. And that certainly was the right thing to do for me. Appreciate that others have a different approach. I'm not going to, lecture them. They make their own calls. But for me, just spending quite a bit of time, 15 years actually, out of the cauldron of politics and actually be in a different world is helpful.
So if we could talk a little bit about that then, your career prior to becoming an MP. But my question, that's in my mind at the minute, is for someone who was so passionate about politics and had been since a young child, I get and completely agree with, stepping away and getting worldly experience. I was told the same before I joined the police, actually, just, learn a bit about life before you get too involved in it. And it was good advice. But, you spent 15 years away. Was that intentional? I mean, you obviously had the intention to learn a little bit more about the world, but, stepping away from what had been your driver for most of your life to that point, was that intentional? And how did that feel?
Yeah, I think I'll put you slightly crook there. I didn't step away from politics per se. What I did is stepped away from the active decision to be an MP.
Right.
Okay. So I stayed involved in the National Party. So I went overseas for a year. I came back. I moved home here to Tauranga. I was very lucky to get a job with Zespri that I then had for 8 years doing all sorts of different stuff there. And whilst I was there, in my private time, I helped the Tauranga electorate because the National Party here had been gutted by Winston Peters pulling out of the National Party and setting up his own party. So we had a very broken National Party here, and I spent my time helping the National Party as a member on the committee. I was Catherine O'Regan's campaign chair in 99, helped out in 02. I was, on the list ranking committee for the party in 99, 02 and 05. So I don't want to give you the sense, and I did earlier, that I stepped away from all things politics. Not at all. I stayed very deeply plugged in to the volunteer side of the National Party. But what I decided to do was not put myself forward as a young candidate when opportunities came up in 99 and 02, but to stay working. And the opportunities kept coming up. Like in 08, and Simon raises it in his book, he and I were on the same committee in Tauranga supporting Bob Clarkson, right? And we all thought Bob was going to stand again, and he didn't. And so everyone would have thought it would have been Simon versus me for that nomination. But I had just started at Apata as a chief executive. So he says in his book, I was the first person he rang to see, who the competition was going to be. And I said, no, it's all yours, mate. And I backed him. I was a delegate, and he got my vote as the candidate for National. And, he built a fantastic career subsequently. And then in 2011, the opportunity presented itself in Coromandel. But I'd just started at Fonterra. And I said, no, I can't do that. So I then assumed I was going to be at Fonterra. It was a senior role there for quite a few years. And then Tony Ryle, after already renominating, decided to step down, but like what I did. and suddenly there was an opportunity. And as Michelle said, well, slightly more vernacular that I'm going to share it. I think it's time you either put your hand up for this or stop talking about it. So I did.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm laughing because I've heard that a few times from different guests. So it's the partners who say, put up or shut up. Basically.
Yeah, pretty much. And that. I mean, she's been a remarkable support through it all.
Yeah. So your roles at Zespri and Fonterra, can we just touch on those for a bit? So tell us a little bit about that. You had kind of leadership roles,
Yes.
I believe, there.
Yep.
Talk to us a little bit about your work experience there as a leader in those, similar, large organisations.
Huge. Yeah, they're great jobs. So I started at Zespri. Actually, I started in the what was called Kiwifruit New Zealand, which was the essentially the parent body, if you like, of Zespri. Zespri was a relatively small, brand new marketing company that was a subsidiary of Kiwifruit New Zealand. Kiwifruit New Zealand held all the sort of regulatory roles. And my job was to project manage a process of corporatisation, which essentially meant the merging of Kiwifruit New Zealand and Zespri into a new corporate structure, and through that, having a complete rewrite of the regulations and principal legislation that underpins the kiwifruit industry. So I had no idea about that. I mean, I can sound like I know what I'm talking about now, reflecting back on it. But at the time when I got that job, I didn't even know what corporatisation meant. I got the job, I think, because the Zespri leadership saw in me the ability to relate to people, and particularly to relate to politicians and the regulators, which had been the world that I'd come from when I was in Jim Bolger's private office. And so that was a huge learning curve for me. And it was a fantastic experience realizing that you can take over a job, you can have a job where you feel, frankly, the scope that is being asked of you here is, a little bit beyond my understanding. But actually with application, you can, and the ability to listen and surround yourself with better people and not be threatened by the fact that there are people around you that are better technically on the subject than you are, and see it as a remarkable resource to enable you to do your job. And I got taught that really through that process. So every other role that I have been in, and I got promoted to various roles within Zespri, all roles back in Zespri related to corporate services in a traditional context. So my team looked after growers, the services that Zespri gave growers, the innovation function, the communication function, the government relations function. And so I had that at Zespri for a number of years. I then left that and became chief executive of Apita. Apita is a kiwifruit packhouse and cool store, large organisation based north of here. My parents were one of the initial shareholders way back in 1985. So I was a chief executive of that for 4 years, and then left that to go to Fonterra. And again in Fonterra, similar roles in terms of overseeing the farmer interface and the CSR, community investment, social investment interface, and of course the government interface, which in Fonterra was huge. So I didn't start in that job. I arrived there, and after a period of time had the good fortune of being promoted into the senior management team, and had a budget of cost centre, I was reminded, of 85 million and 250 staff. So it was big. So I've always had jobs where I was accountable for the relationship between the company and its key growers and suppliers, and particularly the regulatory and political interface, because that's a world that increasingly I understood and knew how to navigate. But I guess one of the big lessons from those leadership roles is the power of promoting people to your management team who are better than you. And I know it's a very trite thing to say, but actually we like to think we do that, but often those words are betrayed by our actions, and actually we tend to appoint people that make us comfortable, that reflect our personalities, reflect our capability and competencies, and are essentially mirror images to an extent of ourselves, right? Where actually I determinedly, with support of very good HR people, to be said, ensured that the teams that I had around me were uncomfortable for me. They were ambitious, they were smart, they were technically astute, they challenged my management style, they made me work as a leader, and I got a hell of a lot out of that because they forced me to be better at what I'm doing. Far more uncomfortable to be a manager of a team like that, where you're, trying to keep up, frankly. But I got a lot out of that.
So where did you kind of, or was it a part of, sort of consequential, but, did you learn from others that was a leadership style that worked, or did it just kind of evolve?
I think it sort of evolved. I think that did evolve. I think one of the best things that Fonterra did for me was their induction was fantastic. So when I arrived into a sort of a mid-level job, it was essentially accountable for Fonterra's strategic relationships in local government and iwi, with a focus of South Island and Taranaki. I shared it with somebody else who had the rest of the country. We had support given to us to do a 100-day plan, or I think it was a 90-day plan from memory. And that I got so much value out of that I went back to HR and said, look, could we continue with the support? And again, it's, I've got to be conscious here that this is Fonterra, the biggest company in New Zealand, massive resources put behind their people, and that is not an SME lived experience. Far from it. You've got to do everything yourself. So I appreciate that, I was very lucky in terms of the roles that I had and the support that I had. But that advice, where somebody sat beside you and actually assisted you in being real clear around what your 90-day plan was, broken down by weeks and months to get yourself up to speed in terms of who are your key stakeholders, who do you need to, what elements of the role are you unsure about, and how do you fix that? So you don't sit there saying, well, I know I'm really good at this, so I'm just going to focus on this and show everyone I can do this bit, but being very mindful about saying, and honest with yourself, that actually saying these elements of the role scare the hell out of me. I don't really know what I'm supposed to be doing. Okay, that's on the table. What do we do to fix that? And you're back here in 2 weeks. We've agreed what you've got to do. When we're back here in 2 weeks, and you get telling me what you have done to fill those gaps. Well, it's a tremendous resource to wrap around someone who's starting at a leadership role. And of course, I kept that up because I could, because it was Fonterra, all through the roles that I then got given. Because within 10 months of starting, I was reporting to the chief executive on the Fonterra leadership team. So it was one hell of a jump up to the leadership team. And so I kept having this guy beside me, helping me through that. And it was a tough time, right? Because, there was a whole lot of internal restructuring going on. We then got hit by food safety scares, the biggest one being a false botulism. I mean, it was hideous in terms of some of the issues we had to manage. But without jumping ahead, this is part of the challenge for me over the last 3 years, is despite being in that environment, in Fonterra, with all that pressure, great people around me, but, a $5 billion market closed on us, and you're with the chairman every day, and Stephen Joyce, as it was from the government side, working out what the strategy was to get it reopened. Like, this was very intense stress moments. I still slept. I had no issues and no portent of what was coming round the corner, a few years later when I became the leader of the National Party. So that was a tremendous job, and I would not have left Fonterra unless the opportunity to be the MP for my home city appeared, but it did. Not expected. And so, the opportunity presented itself.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That's good. We might make some connections back to what you've just been saying there about that pressure and stuff as we go through your political career. So, 2014, am I right? Is that when you started and when you got elected as MP for Bay of Plenty?
Yeah. So how that works is firstly you've got to be nominated by the party as your candidate. So Tony Ryall stepped down, said he wasn't going to stand again after all. So I put my name forward and ran a process, and on June the 3rd, 2014, got the support of the local National Party people and just basically hit the ground running. I knocked on 12,000 doors and introduced myself as the National Party candidate. And look, we did very well. We got a massive party vote and got a huge support locally. But I acknowledge that support came from the fact that, and you must always never forget this in politics, it was the people that got you there in terms of the National Party people. And I was there. I got elected because I was a National Party, right? And so John Key said to me right at this sort of start, both Michelle and I, sort of advice was first 3 years, work your ass off locally. People, and like everything in life, there's first impressions, right? So there's this new person who's become elected. Who is he? Oh, some national guy's got re-elected or been elected. What's he like? It's a blank canvas, and you have to make sure that the people in your community of Papamoa and Mangatapu and Te Puna and Kaimai, when they have that conversation, oh, what's that new guy? What's that new guy like? That people say, oh, he's a pretty hard worker from what I can see. Because people make a decision about you. They decide that you are either someone who's got their interests at heart and work hard, and then once that's locked in, that's what they think about you. Yeah. And frankly, that's no different. Whatever the career, whatever professional role you choose, that applies. But I think it particularly applies to politics. So I just really worked hard locally and absolutely loved it because these are my people, right? This is my city. We moved here in 1974 when there were 27,000 people. Yeah. There was no Papamoa. Well, there was actually one street. And now look at it.
How did it feel then? Obviously we've talked about your journey from being a child, wanting to get into politics, and now you're in it, right? You've achieved it. You've been elected, and you're doing it. How did that feel? Was that a good kind of?
Oh, it was an incredible experience. It was just the sense of accomplishment and destiny was just extraordinary, right? But as I mentioned earlier, destiny and hubris are two sides of the same coin. But at that point, it was just a remarkable feeling. I loved Wellington because it was familiar, right? So we did the induction, which was remarkable. I didn't even know that Parliament did inductions. Certainly didn't do inductions back in the 90s. And so this was a modern Parliament and where, you have the sort of expected support around you in terms of this is your job, this is, traditional induction. And I was walking around that induction and saw so many other fellow MPs arriving for the first time, and they were like, oh my gosh, this place. And I knew it, right? It was a familiar space for me. It had changed, certainly not as much smoking and drinking and cavorting, I think, which is a good thing. But it was familiar. So to be there and then to give your maiden speech and you have a korowai from the local Te Puna community and the appearance in the gallery and your family and it's a very, very special time. And it was in a remarkable government to be a part of. I was a backbencher, right at the bottom of the tree, literally. The person who took the minutes, the lowest ranked person. And I put my hand up for that. There were 14 of us that came in that year, and they said, someone's got to have the lowest job, which is taking the minutes. And I said, well, I'll do it. It's fine. You start the bottom. And so, observing the key English government. I mean, it was a well-oiled machine, right? We were all through that period where, that first term, really until Jacinda turned up, 8 weeks from the 2020 election, National was miles ahead. That's why they made the change in 2020, is that, Andrew Little was 15 points behind, 8 weeks to go. And so, I was part of a remarkable third-term government, just watching it. And so what do? You get put into select committees. So you have two parts of the job. One, and I think people might be surprising for some people, it is like two jobs wrapped into one. So you do lots of hours. You've got your local job. So what's the local job? Supporting communities, being at events, from school fairs to, nighttime events. You've got an office where people who need assistance to navigate the challenges of their life through the bureaucracy of the country come for assistance, regardless of which way they vote. And my team, and I've been really blessed with fantastic people, they assist those constituents with their challenges. And when it's really gnarly, it needs a minister to perhaps have another look, I swing into action and try and assist. So you've got that element of the job, and that's continuous. Like, my office is open 5 days a week. And then when you go down to Wellington, Tuesday to Thursday, 30 weeks of the year, it's like having another 40-hour week. You then become a legislator. As opposed to a community advocate and supporter, you then become a legislator, where you're poring over law, proposed law, what should change, what shouldn't change, the bear pit of Parliament fighting over the direction of the country, and hugely stimulating environment. And you just get all sorts of opportunities, right? You get put on select committees, which are the committees that pore over the proposed legislation that's relevant to that portfolio, like education or foreign affairs. And I ended up chairing foreign affairs and defence and trade. I went to Iraq. This is all in my first term. I went to Iraq with the Minister of Defence. In 2016, I went to the two American conventions, the Republican Convention and the Democratic Convention, 1 week after the other. Listened to Obama, listened to Trump, met Jesse Jackson. I mean, these are out there experiences, and that was just in the first term. Right? Mm-hmm. So remarkable job, and absolutely loved it. And had a very good personal result here in 2017, but we lost. Got more votes, but we lost, and then we went into opposition, and then the wheels began to fall off. The party, and it was a challenging time.
What was it like? I mean, I can tell from your voice and the way you're talking about it. It's sort of stacked up to be what you'd maybe
totally
hoped or if not surpassed that. But
yes,
if you think about the reasons why you wanted to get into politics and what you wanted to achieve, was that what you thought? I mean, I'm sort of conscious of the fact that some people get into politics. The reason why I considered it was because you want to see some change. And is it easy to make that change when you're in politics, or do you get caught up in the machine? And
great question. So depends what change you seek. If you are wanting to be and I think all elected MPs, regardless of persuasion, would have this view, I think, is being an elected MP, where you have the obligation of being an advocate for your community, means that you do have the opportunity to make small changes in people's lives which are profound for them. I'll just give you an example. It might be someone has, not been appropriately supported through the health system. It might be an immigration case. It always relates to services provided by the government agencies which are not due the individual. It hasn't worked for them. And your office's ability to get in and through your own personality, relationships, advocacy, understanding of the detail, making a change for them, you do change people's lives. And some of the, there has been some incredibly emotional moments where you have changed people's lives for the better, right? And have them in tears on the other end of the phone. It's very, it's a privilege to be able to do that. So you are absolutely making a difference at an individual family level, right? And that's a big part of being a community leader. And then you go to the Wellington side, where the change that you can facilitate, by and large, only happens if you're in government, right? I have been lucky. I have had 2 members' bills, one a technical change to the Cooperative Companies Act, and the other a bit more substantive, the change of labelling obligations on sunscreen, that got selected from the ballot, so that's completely random, and then got the opposition, which is the Labor government, to support, which is almost unheard of. So I've had 2 successes there. Put that in context, Trevor Mallard was a politician for 32 years, never had one bill pulled out of the ballot. So I've had 2 in opposition, and both of them got government support. So that was pretty cool. So, but putting that aside, you only get to make a change when you're the government in terms of those broad priorities, policy priorities. So that, I think that is, that's why you go into politics. I think people go into politics though for different reasons. There are different emphasis on that. Some people really enjoy the community advocacy piece, and other people are very ideological. They have an absolute view that a set of policies applied in this way will deliver this outcome for New Zealand. My experience is that the smaller parties on the more, not extreme, but at the more sort of outer edges of our political system, think ACT and Greens, are more the latter. They are more parties that are very focused on individual policy prescriptions that they believe must be adopted by the country, and that drives them. For the Green Party, obviously a huge amount of focus on social justice and environmental policy. And that, to them, that is all that counts, right, is delivering on that. You look at the ACT side, it is a far more a liberal set of policies, which is around, economic, the rationalisation of the state and its involvement and of economic reset. The 2 tribes of New Zealand politics, Labor and National, end up being the parties of compromise. A lot of people don't like that word. The flip side of compromise is pragmatism, because ultimately you only get a bill passed if you've got 60 votes, right? And so you've got to cut deals. You've got to work out a way that actually gets something done, even if it's not perfect. So that famous line of the, perfect being the enemy of good, or politics is the art of the possible, not necessarily what should be done based on your own political philosophy, but what is possible to be done. And it's incremental, and it's hard yards, right? And so if I have a concern around the way politics is heading, is I see the country generally getting more divisive. I see greater anger in our community, I think, because some of the sort of truisms of life that people had become used of, in terms of the ability to, not only get a job, but have a job that you feel fulfilled in and you can stay in over time, has been completely smashed over the last 15, 20 years. Everyone knows that they're going to have to go through many different jobs and iterations over their lives, and I think that creates a sense of unease, because certainty there's no certainty in employment in terms of the nature of the employment. There is increasing inability for people to get housing. So those who have housing have kids that do not, and there are many in this community that can't have housing. This is simply beyond them. And you look at the money, the average money that people get for their work and then you look at the price of the house and you think, oh, I'm never going to get there. And that creates a sense of unease. And then I think you can't ignore the fact that, we have had a massive disruption in terms of COVID, and that has created a real sense of unease. So I think that's a long-winded way of saying that some of the sort of broader certainties that we had in life, that if you get a good education, get a decent job, you'll, settle down, buy a house, maybe have some kids, and if you work hard, you'll be in a reasonable space. And there was a sort of certainty about that, and I feel that is quite vulnerable for a lot of people today. And then you sort of lift up and see New Zealand in the context of a broader a global economic environment, and it's and a geopolitical environment. It's pretty out there, right? You've got climate change and the uncertainty of that. You've got geopolitical tensions, the rise of China. We're hugely dependent on China. It's a fifth of all of our export income, at least. And you see all these things happening, and people are uneasy. And I think that uneasiness has turned, in some cases, to more pointed anger. And you have, the rise of the Māori ambition in that context. What does that look like? Some voices suggest, the treaty obligation is 50-50 co-governance on everything. Clearly, that is, untenable for a lot of New Zealanders. And so you've got all these layers, and then you put social media on it, where people feel able to voice their concerns in the most unfettered way, and you have an environment which, from my perspective, is increasingly unattractive politically, and I think increasingly fraught for New Zealand. That's a bit of a speech. Didn't quite mean to launch into
it's
one
good.
of
It's
those.
good. There's so much in there. There's too much in there for us to go through today. But I'm going to pick up on a couple of things if I can, because
Yes.
You used the word. I'd like to come back to you changing from the key English government and into opposition. It'd be good to come back to that. But that word opposition, and just relative to what you've been talking about, the sort of uncertainty that we've got globally, not just in New Zealand, but if we focus on our country, our economy for a minute, that kind of division that's growing, and everyone can feel it, I think.
Yes.
Is there an element of, what influence do you think does Parliament have in that? You've talked about the two main players, Labour and National, and one's in government, one's in opposition, and just the language and terminology that we use. You mentioned there as well about the fact that you got support from the opposition for a bill, which was kind of unheard of. You don't often get that.
No, it's quite rare.
With those parties, it seems from the outside looking in sometimes, and this is just my observation, that there's an element of opposing for opposing's sake, because that's what we're supposed to do. We're in opposition. Whereas actually, is there an opportunity there for us to collaborate a lot more on elements that are good for all New Zealanders? And does that kind of two-party division at a parliament level, is that kind of now being reflected in the way that things are happening, or the division we see in the country in some way, shape, or form? I was thinking about the leadership and examples set by politics and politicians. If we're going to get change, where does that start?
Well, there's a lot in that too.
Yeah, sorry.
So few thoughts. We have we don't have a constitution, but we have a series of laws that create a framework in which we operate. We run a Westminster system taken from the British, so the government has the power to enact its policies, tax and spend that taxation as they see fit. And the opposition we are called His Majesty's loyal opposition. I mean, that's when we get sworn in, you're His Majesty's government and His Majesty's loyal opposition. Loyal to the King, obviously, but also the job is to critique the government's proposals. And actually, good government needs that tension. It is absolutely critical that government policy and thinking and spending needs to be critiqued. Needs to be critiqued formally, in the sort of legislative process that I touched on in terms of the Select Committee, but it also needs to be critiqued in the political theatre of the chamber, or what people think of Parliament, where they see us standing up and shouting at each other. And that's a really important part. But there is something to your observation that I think is true and is troubling me, is that over the last 9 years, it feels to me that the nature of the criticism of governments and individuals in governments have become more personal and more toxic. Not necessarily in Parliament, because we have very strict rules around what we're allowed to say and not allowed to say. You can't stand up in Parliament and say, you're a liar. You can't even say you, because you're referencing the Speaker. So you've got to say, so we've got all these strict standing orders, they're called, rules essentially around how our discourse occurs in Parliament. But that said, there's still, it is always going to be a place of fierce debate. And I think that's fine. I don't have a problem with the chamber being a place of fierce debate. What concerns me is the broader avenues for political discourse beyond Parliament, which historically was just the media, in terms of a journalist's interpretation of what you said and what I said, and some hopefully balanced assessment of that debate. The media, in the traditional sense, is increasingly bypassed by social media, where the same protagonists, the politicians, and those who and the public critique the politicians and the journalists, are on the platform of Twitter, bashing the hell out of each other. And the language that's used on that is completely over the top and poisonous and toxic, none of which is allowed in the debating chamber. But you can say whatever you want on social media largely, and people do. And so politicians, not all of them, I hardly ever go on Twitter, but some of my colleagues and the Labor Party are constantly out there promoting their view, and I think fiercely and personally and in a toxic way attacking the opposition. Not only politicians, but also commentators, individuals who have a particular view on life. They're all in there, right? And the journalists are watching and creating and facilitating that. Fueling it. And then you've got the more less so the Instagram and stuff, but Facebook is another platform where people, when I put stuff on Facebook, I have someone in my office that sits and moderates and takes out the stuff. Not that's critical to me per se, but the language they use is appalling. It is absolutely vicious language. They will crawl into, they will attack me for my lack of competency. They will attack me for mental health. Seriously. And so my office tries to hide those. So at least it's not a complete, And so to your question around, what's the leadership then that politicians should show, and what's the behaviour that politicians should try and model in that context, is a very good one, because, in my view, I'd put a line through Twitter. I think it brings the worst of us, and doesn't necessarily show politicians in a good light, because you end up just having fierce partisan conversations all the time in that. And the more fiercer those engagements are, the more edge it then brings to your engagement in the chamber and in your engagement in terms of the broader select committee process, which is supposed to be collaborative. How select committees work is that you've got the majority, I don't, you put this legislation on, we don't like the legislation, we're going to vote against it, but we are now going to spend the next 6 months listening to people's feedback on the legislation, and where we can, we'll try and find agreement on areas that could change, which still means you get your intent, but actually the legislation is better law. That's what should happen. Personally, part of the reason that I'm stepping aside is that I've just run out of enthusiasm for the nature of politics and the political engagement. Probably the high point, second only to being elected the leader of the National Party, was what I did with James Shaw on the zero carbon bill. We negotiated for months to come up with a framework to deal with climate change that would be bipartisan. And we got it across the line. It was a close run thing, but we got it across the line. And I feel very proud about that, the small part I played in having a piece of legislation that should be enduring, that enables exactly what happened yesterday, an independent climate commission, give advice not only to the government, but to the opposition and to the country, saying, we said we needed to be here, we're here, here's the gap, here's how we better fix it. By the way, these policies that the government's doing need to change. It's exactly what you want. And I feel proud about that. But those examples of bipartisanship are few and far between.
Yeah. And it's leading by example, isn't it? So if you think about the behaviour on Twitter, for instance, what's that demonstrating to the rest of the population about how we engage?
Yeah.
I'm reminded we had Angie Warren-Clark here a few weeks ago. Great conversation. But she talked about the vulnerability that she feels that she's got in public because of the way that people are behaving towards her. And I think that's a change that we've seen.
Yes, it is.
In New Zealand over the last few years.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, it's been apparent for a long time overseas, but not here. So something has changed, hasn't it, over the last few years, the way that people feel towards politicians, and whether that's the general uncertainty of society these days, or whether it's a reflection of politics in this country. I'm not sure which comes first.
Which does come first. Ultimately, politics reflects society, I think. Now, I know that doesn't remove the obligation from us to show leadership in terms of behaviour and tone, and what we call out as acceptable and what we don't call out as and what we accept. But that is, it is a increasingly fragmented and fraught society. And I know Ange. I think she's a great person, and I have enjoyed the fact that my political opponent here is someone that I know well, and I would consider a friend, actually, not a close friend, but we knew each other at university, and she's a great person, and she advocates for her values and her community well. And I see no reason why you can't have a relationship like that. People will vote with who they want to vote for, but you should be able to respect somebody with a different political view, because it's a valid view. I don't think it's a view that is right for the country. I prefer National to be in power. But her view is valid, and her right to hold the view is valid. And it's appalling that she's been subjected to the online abuse. But, it's not just her. I think the way people reacted to Jacinda was outrageous. I thought many elements of her policy were appalling in terms of policy, but the vitriol and the misogyny, just shocking. Not from everybody, of course, but the problem is the more this occurs, the more we become desensitized to it, the more we just accept it as just the noise of day-to-day life, the worse it is for the civility of politics. And that worries me.
And does it become more about, my fear, you've got a love of American politics. I suppose when I look at that from afar, I think it's all about personalities. So, I know very little about American policy. It tends to be based on who do you like, who you're going to vote for, and it's about personalities. Are we at risk here of kind of policy becoming less of a factor and feature for people to consider and more about personality types, because we seem to be targeting the personality of people rather than their policy, which is what you just pointed out about with Jacinda Ardern. Policies may have been flawed from your perspective, but that she's doing the best that she can, like you're doing the best that you can.
Yeah.
But we don't attack the policies, we attack the people. And so is that where we're heading? Is it going to become more about personalities than policy?
Well, that is where it's heading, in my view. We are not America, we are not Australia, we're not Canada, we're not the United Kingdom, but our traditions are more tightly aligned to that than they are of any other jurisdiction in the world, and that's where they're going rapidly. And you can see the same elements in New Zealand politics. Now, my prediction is that this election is going to be brutal. Hopefully it breaks more significantly to national than it is at the moment. But I can see, the next 6 months being a pretty brutal arm wrestle between National Labour that appear to be sort of locked in a sort of largely the same vote each space. Their respective partners, Green Act respectively, largely on the same numbers. And, that's bounced around now for 6 months longer, and it's largely been the same. And you think, goodness me, this means we are going to have, there doesn't seem to be a lot of middle ground. Either there's going to be an absolute call for change or an absolute let's keep it as the same, and it's going to be pretty brutal out there. And we must not lose the civility, right? If you get to the point where you just really dislike the person who holds the different political view than you, you're in trouble. And I see it everywhere, and I do not see it as just a creature of the right. And I hate that. I hate the sense of hate's too strong. I dislike the fact that, you see it on Twitter, people of right persuasion, attack viciously the woke tendencies of the left, and the left attack the right as sort of an incarnation of fascism. And we're using labels with all the subjective weight of history in them as carefree, that we just throw it at each other. And where does that lead? Sorry for it being in a moment of downerness in this podcast.
No, I think it's good to
it
talk
worries
about.
me, right?
Yeah.
It genuinely worries me, and I think most people just focusing on getting through each day and doing what they need to do to try and pay the bills and get ahead. But there's a sense of growing concern out there behind them around, New Zealand today feels different to New Zealand 15 years ago on a number of fronts.
Yep.
And that's not one government's fault, in my view. It is what it is. We are different, but I think we need to be open about the fact that we are and work out ways of actually identifying opportunities to bind us together, as opposed to just heading on down this path where, if you vote for Labor, then I can't have you around for dinner.
Yeah, it seems that's the way it's heading, isn't it?
Mm.
I'm pleased we're talking about it. I'd like to talk about it a lot more. I think there's so much more in here as well, but it'd be remiss of me to not talk about your progress through the National Party and leadership. And so to take you back to the part of the conversation where you said in 2017 the wheels came off party-wise. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of what was happening there? You were now in opposition as opposed to coming into being an MP in Parliament in government. It must be quite a transition to then be in opposition.
Huge.
And what was that like, and what was the leadership change that came about? What was that like for you during that period?
Oh, look, I think it was very hard on the National Party, and particularly the caucus, which, we got 43.5% of the vote. Labor got 37. It's hard to imagine when you say that you lose, but that's what happened. First time ever under MMP that was the case. And quite rare overseas. Normally, if the other MMP jurisdictions, if you got the most votes, then you are assumed to have won the election, and the minor parties then worked with you to try and progress their agenda. Obviously, didn't work like that. There's nothing, there's nothing illegitimate with the way it happened. It was totally it's just the way the numbers worked. You got to get to 60. We couldn't get to 60. And so you have a caucus that only weeks before were cabinet ministers, senior cabinet ministers, up-and-coming cabinet ministers who had the levers of power and who, frankly, only months before assumed they were going to win in a canter. I mean, literally 10 weeks before the election, we were up by 15 points, right? And we all know what happened. So that adjustment from 9 years of government into opposition, and then also being opposition, the biggest opposition, we had 58 votes or something. I mean, Labor together got 63. Labor, Greens and New Zealand First had 63. And we were 56 ourselves. And so, you're this huge opposition party. And that adjustment didn't work, right? And there were multiple reasons for that. I think the ministers struggled to get their heads around the fact that, now they were in opposition. I think those ambitious amongst us could see opportunity to climb the ladder in opposition. And obviously the first big dramatic transition was Bill deciding that he wasn't going to keep in charge of this. And then we have a pretty intense leadership battle, which Simon was successful in. Being the leader of the opposition is described as the worst job in the world, certainly in the country. He gave it everything. And, to his credit, had the party in a reasonable position going into 2020. And then COVID hit, and then, our vote collapsed, right? And by that stage, I had the profile of the Zero Climate Bill, the climate change profile. I then got put by Simon into agriculture and had pretty strong support within that sector. And I was seen as an alternative to him. And so the conversations began. And, this is when ego and hubris start rearing its head again, because, I saw an opportunity where actually this could work in a way that I could be the leader of the National Party and potentially Prime Minister at the end of 2020. And so it got, pretty tense there in the caucus as it became clear that Simon's support was ceding away, particularly from the broader country, and that was impacting the national vote. And there was quite a lot of conversation within the party and outside that actually we needed to make a change, and I was the person that we needed to change to. And so that happened in May, and it was a remarkable point, to find yourself, to challenge Simon for the leadership and to win it, and to have caucus support to be the leader of the National Party. It was a remarkable moment.
Can I ask you? You mentioned there about conversations going on. I'm interested in, were you kind of shoulder tapped? I don't know how it works behind the scenes, So you kind of shoulder tapped and suggested that actually, support's kind of waning a little bit. We need to change. You'd be a good option here, or was it more you're seeing an opportunity and your ambition from childhood, thinking there's an opportunity for me here, I'm going to step up? So
it was genuinely both.
Okay.
And I know that some listening to this podcast may have a different view, but it was genuinely both. Clear signals from a number of people internally and external that the change needed to happen and that I was the change that people wanted to back, and me seeing the opportunity to actually make that happen. Or at least, deeply consider whether it should happen. Now, my view is it was still an open question right up to probably a week or so from when it happened, when it became very clear that it really needed to be sorted one way or another, and also the polling was pretty perilous, frankly. We were heading to a massive defeat, and so the change was made, and that initial sense of elation, particularly on the day, was quite something I'll never never forget. But as well documented, it didn't last long.
No, it didn't. It didn't. But well, we can come to that. I mean, you've spoken about that quite widely, and I don't want to brush over it, but I'd like to spend a bit more time talking about how that works from a time frame point of view. You've said that within a couple of weeks. I can't think of any other scenario where someone might be, kind of given the opportunity and steps into a major, not just a major leadership role, but it's a major public role, with only sort of a couple of weeks build up, or lead time or preparation time. What does that look like? The mechanics of it behind the scenes. I suppose until you challenge, you don't know whether you're going to get the role or not. But once you get the role, it seemed from the outside in, you're just in at the deep end, and boots and all.
Yeah.
And it's hitting the road with the wheels spinning type of thing, as opposed to in a corporate world that you'd have your 90-day plan, you'd have your opportunities.
There was no 90-day
right?
plan, and that's, I look back on that with some regret. Really, is that. Certainly in the weeks prior, there was quiet conversations between those who supported me around, how tenable was Simon's leadership. But it certainly wasn't a, well choreographed, here's the plan for the next, the 90-day plan. As it became clearer that change was inevitable, more focus got put on, how to manage the transition on the first couple of days. But there was no plan in terms of the 90-day. We're only 100 days out from the election.
Yeah.
And, I have to live with that. I can't unwind the fact that I challenged and won, and the wheels fell off my particular leadership. Then, of course, Judith took over, and then on it went in terms of wheels and falling off. But it was a process where you can see that we're under pressure. You have a small group of people who see the same things as you do and start thinking, well, if this keeps up, we're going to have to make some change here, because we can't go to the election on 20-something%. And that's where it was heading. And so you begin those conversations, but they are, they're relatively high level. And like I say, it was really only in the last 2 weeks where some genuine substance around what a transition could look like actually came together. Of course, the counter, if you were interviewing others, they'll say, "Oh, you had it planned for months." And it was all lined up to to take him out, and that isn't true. It wasn't. In retrospect, had it been, we might have been more successful if we had done the sort of pre-90-day plan. But this is the challenge of politics, right? Because we're sort of looking back now through the dispassionately 3 years afterwards. When you're in the middle of it and you're coming out of COVID, and for better or for worse, the leader that you've got is struggling to connect with people, and there's a real challenge in terms of our ability to be heard as a political party, and our policies even reflected on. And you were the party of government 3 years early, and you still are a huge caucus of 55, 56. And you're looking at polling going through the floor, knowing that half of you don't have your jobs if it keeps up at that rate. It's a very febrile situation, right? And so, you have Simon trying to do the job, no doubt feeling like he's being constantly undermined by all this conversation about the fact that he's not good enough. I'm in that mix saying, if this keeps up, we're going to get absolutely smashed. What's the alternative? So these are sort of, it's a very dynamic, and it is completely not corporate in that context. So you don't say, right, here's the plan. We're going to have to execute the plan on this date, and here's how we're going to run it, and here's the people that we're going to have in all the jobs. As Nikki Kay said at the time after we made the change, it felt like you were flying the plane and building it at the same time. And which is a fair assessment of what was going on. And frankly, because of that lack of planning, and probably some of the personalities involved, and the disappointment from the outgoing leadership that frankly didn't make it easy either, not surprisingly, it was a pretty messy time, and you do the best you can in that environment, but it was pretty messy.
The reason for my questioning really is to look at it kind of objectively, and this is a workplace. You are at work.
Yeah.
And I've obviously looked at a lot of interviews from that time and since, and I always try to put myself in the shoes of other people. It's impossible because I've not got the experiences that you've got and the life that you've led. So, but I'll try my best to sort of put myself in that situation and imagine how I would have felt under those circumstances. And it seemed like to me that it is chaotic. It's quick change. There's no plan. It's not something you've done before, albeit you've had dreams of doing. That in itself is probably giving you an edge of excitement and willingness to sort of go with the flow, go with it. But timing wise as well, I look at that and I think to myself, it was sort of 4 months before the election.
Yes.
And actually, when I looked at the way that the media were behaving with you in particular, it didn't. I don't think it was the same when Jacinda did what she did 6 or 8 weeks out, because the campaigning was going on. There was more for the media to focus on. It seemed like 4 months out, there was nothing else for the media to focus on but you. And you became the subject, of topic of conversation and scrutiny. And I think all of that combined, from the outside looking in, looked like an enormous amount of pressure.
Yeah.
So, and then, you're doing your best, but those first few days look like hell, to be honest with you, from the outside looking in.
Yeah. I think that's.
And so is there some consequences of the way the things happen, because it's politics and it's different? It kind of has to happen that way. But is it consequential that because of that and the timing and the people involved and what was going on, everything else, did that all contribute to how you were feeling?
Yeah, no doubt, absolutely. Look, you can't dodged the fact that ultimately it was a call that I thought change needed to happen. And, so did other people. And ultimately so did the National Party caucus. But the management of it, of that transition, was, tough and occurred in the most extreme of circumstances, right? And you can run through your mind, could you have done it differently? Should you have done it differently? What would happen if you didn't, if you held on and let Simon take it through to the election? Would he have got better than 25% that Judith got? Don't know. At the time, it looked pretty perilous from our perspective. And so you make the judgments at the time that you think are the right for the party and the country. But in terms of, was it good management practice or good organisational practice? Far from it. Arguably the complete opposite. But that's the difference between business and politics, right? Politics, it's hugely dynamic, organic. You're in it. You're in it, right? You're in the trenches, and the public were rapidly turning off us, and we were saying, well, can we afford just to let this go, or should we do a circuit breaker? That was effectively the judgment, and we decided to do the circuit breaker. And you're quite right to say, yeah, but from the outside, it looked like you didn't have a clear plan to what you were going to do when you got in there, and that's a fair criticism, right? There were elements that were clear in our head, but there are other elements that weren't. There's one of the criticisms that we get from that period was that we just tore up the policy program that had been set in place. Well, the policy program that was set in place was reflective of a pre-COVID environment. So it all needed to be reassessed anyway in very, very tight time frame. So it was a remarkably unique and high tension environment. But ultimately you do what you think's the right thing. And just in our case, it didn't work. And I, that sits with me for the rest of my life because I made a call. I felt it was the right call, and didn't see the unraveling of my mental health in the equation. Of course I didn't. If I knew that was going to be sitting around the corner, I would have made a completely different decision. But I didn't know, and I was highly energised by the opportunity to actually be the leader of the National Party and assist us through that change. And the initial media reaction, the initial polling reaction was very positive. The single poll that I had in my time, we jumped 8 points. Not enough to win, but back into the high 30s, which was a great position to be in. But as you quite pointed out, my inability, because of the challenges that I was, having in my head, to navigate that time and provide the sort of assured leadership that you need when you're sort of building a plane at 40,000 feet, just didn't materialise. And that's frustrating. Right?
Yeah,
for me, I look back on that and I think, you've had leadership roles in Fonterra and Zespri and Apita, and also very stressful senior roles. And I provided leadership and I provided assurance and I provided guidance and judgment. But here I got caught in an environment where, I was paralysed. And when you are the leader and you're paralysed and you can't provide the necessary, judgment and perspective, then, that's a hellish place for everybody else to try and operate. So, you've got to own it.
I think, to be fair to you, Todd, it wasn't a criticism of your leadership there. I was sort of looking at the circumstances under which you were required to demonstrate leadership. You said earlier when you talked about Fonterra and Zespri that you had great people around you, and people who knew more than you did, and that's what leadership's about.
Yeah.
So I was coming at it from the angle of, well, who around you was helping and supporting that process, and my question, I've got some questions about what you learned from that process. You said that you've got to sit with that for the rest of your life. They're all lessons learned,
They are.
right?
Yep.
So I'm interested in talking about that. But before we go there, I don't want to forget to ask this, so I'm going to ask it now. Is what's the party learned? Like I said, talk about it from an employment point of view. It's a workplace, and once again, New Zealand look to Parliament, look to the parties, of whether they do it consciously or unconsciously. We're getting guidance and leadership from them. What does the party learn from experiences like that, and what would they do differently next time? Has there been any conversation about that, or is it just?
Yeah, I think we had a review of the 2020 election, and which was wide ranging, and looked at it both through the lens of what caucus could have done differently, and which is the MPs, and what the party could have done differently. And I think you can see, particularly in the last year and a half under Chris Luxon's leadership, that those lessons are being learned. That people talk about discipline, and it is a critical part of political success, is the ability to hang together, and keep together even when times are tough, right? And I think clearly that term between 2017 and 2020, there were many examples of us not showing that discipline. And it's in place now. I think the way that the transition from Judith to Chris was managed reflected a maturity that didn't occur when Simon and I were in the space, and even arguably the transition from Bill to the competition and then Simon winning. So I think we have learnt those lessons. And the funny thing about it all, though, Steve, is that these are lessons that get learned and then unlearned in the cycle of politics, because we went through it all post the Bolger years in the early 2000s, when we went Shipley, English, Brash, and then back to Key, and those dynamics of internal pressure, party dissatisfied about where we're tracking and the cut through that we've got, those who support the party having that similar view, the internal pressures and personalities and groups of people, positioning for and against individuals, all of that manifested through the early 2000s. We then came together under John Key and Bill English and had 9 years of success, and we saw Labor go through exactly the same process in opposition. Euphemistically tearing each other's eyes out, right? And tutting them from the side, saying, well, we will never do that because we've learnt from our experiences previously. But, there we were in opposition and, succumbing to the same sort of pressures and behaviour. And I think that sort of talks to the sort of structural reality of, you asked before about why you go into politics and the power, the drivers of it. When you're in government, you are in charge, right? And so therefore opposition, particularly extended opposition, period, is hugely demoralising, because all you do is critique and hold a view at what they could be doing different. But at a level, it's just noise because you don't have the levers of power. And so there becomes a huge focus on who the right people need to be at number 1, 2, and 3, and who, to actually get yourself back there. Because that's the number one objective, is you've got to get back to sitting around that table. And so that's why you have these hugely challenging periods for political parties when they're in opposition. It's gone on always. When you're in opposition, after a period of government, it's normally very tumultuous until you eventually land on the right individual or team to get yourself back in the game. Same thing has happened to us, and then we landed on the right leadership team with Chris and Nicola. And now, we're in a very different position. So lessons do get learned, but then the immediacy of that, the consequences of not following the lessons gets lost normally during a period of government. And so then when you tip back into opposition, you find yourself back in the wilderness, and you revert to type.
Yeah. So I don't want to sort of go too deep into that period of time. I do want to touch on it. It'd be remiss for me not to, but it's been well documented.
Yeah.
But at what point I want to tap into, if I can, at what point you realised, shit, actually, this is not what or it's harder than I thought it was going to be, or I'm not going to be able to do this. That kind of moment of realisation. Yeah. And how that felt, given the context of what we've talked about today, how much you wanted that kind of leadership role and, to be, president / prime minister.
Yeah.
That must have been tough to have that kind of realization happening for you.
Dreadful. But the way you frame that up sounds like a sort of, a rational, dispassionate assessment of, this job's a bit more than I expected. I'm going to have to step away. And of course, it wasn't like that at all. It was horror of a complete mental health breakdown, right? And so it was about getting through the day as opposed to reflecting on legacy or regret that I couldn't do the job that I had always wanted. That came later, but at the time, when you're in the middle of the horror of it all falling apart in your head, frankly, you're just trying to get through each day. Like, I was so struck by that documentary that Robin Malcolm did, and I was asked to participate in that about anxiety, because they showed footage of me doing one of my last press conferences, and I looked appalling, absolutely appalling. And I'd never seen any footage of when I was the leader, because once you're the leader, it's so, as every former leader knows, it's non-stop, right? It just goes, 18 hours a day. And so you don't have time to sit and look at how your media performances are gone, because it's just the next one's there, and then the next one. So you're just going non-stop, right? And so I'd never seen what I looked like. And then I saw it and on that documentary, and I was pretty shocked, actually, around the physical deterioration that was matching the mental deterioration. But look, I at the time, it was so acute and so debilitating that I wasn't sitting there going, "Oh, if I step aside, this is me." I mean, the pain was so overwhelming. And that's the other thing that I'd never experienced anything like this before. I'd had these challenges at Zespri and challenges at Fonterra, big challenges in terms of botulism, some false botulism scares. And at worst, I'd had a bit of disturbed sleep. Full stop. Never had it. Never had to know what an anxiety attack was. Never experienced one in my life before. And they were just basically non-stop. And what I had not, looking back, I had no understanding about the pain of them. Like, the physical pain of mental health is something that you never forget. And it's pretty brutal. Well, it's more than brutal. And I just, at the end of it, I just simply wanted the pain to stop. It wasn't, this is the end of my career, this is, shame on my family or anything like that. It was just, can the pain stop? And I was essentially given the permission to walk away from the fire, and that's what it felt like. And then, of course, just bone deep fatigue, and just slept and slept and slept, and slowly recover. And that's a journey, right? That's the other thing with this is, when you get to that point, and you walk away, it's not like flicking a switch. You don't sort of wake up the next morning and say, "Oh, that's good, I'm fine now." It is a profound experience, and so in my case, you need to do some deep reflection and work to rebuild your resilience from that, and that's a work in progress from my perspective. But what I have decided to do is be open about it, because, and Michelle, to her credit, when we were talking about it, she said, "Well, pretty much everyone knows what's happened. They can sort of see that you've fallen over here, and so let's just, you don't hunt the story, but if people ask you, just say this is what it's like." And I think in a small way that's been useful.
Do you find it hard to articulate exactly how it felt and how it came about? The reason I ask is I've got a daughter who at a young age suffered from anxiety, and I thought I understood what anxiety was. I had no idea until I suffered from it myself. But I've found it very hard to kind of describe that to other people, what that felt like, and what triggered it or what led to it. Because I think when you talk about building resilience, trying to understand how things come about helps you spot the kind of signs or symptoms that might be leading towards that. But do you find it hard to put your finger on that, or?
I don't find it hard to describe what it felt like, and I do have the capacity to identify the familiar early signs now. So I guess the challenge is working out, for me, the big challenge is, so now what? I had rebuilt myself quite well, and Chris had given me agriculture and climate change, front bench, and I think we will probably win. There'll be a scrap, but I think we'll probably win. And I couldn't do it because I just could, in my deep gut, felt that I just didn't have the capacity and energy to do 100 and something hours a week. And I have found myself increasingly frustrated with some of the more toxic comments that get directed to you as an MP, not about my performance, but about politics generally. You're out and about and people come up and let rip about, their views on the world. And historically, even if I disagreed with people, I would get energy from that. And I am, increasingly frustrated by that. And so you look at the way politics is heading. I'm a collaborative politician, I think, rather than a combative one. My own resilience. And I thought, you know what? I think it's time to just step aside and let someone else have a go at this. Because I don't want to be back in that position. And I'm not entirely sure that I wouldn't be. And so because I have that familiarity of that, because I've walked in that journey and in that fire, I do have a sense of what that feels like when it starts again. And, I just don't want to go back there.
And so what you're saying there, Todd, is that you feel that if you stayed on, you had the front bench role, that would potentially the kind of work ethic that you need, the hours, the time away from home, all of that kind of stuff could lead to another
I think
episode
it could
of
have,
that.
yeah. And then when you overlay the sort of my sort of sense of where politics is heading and my dislike of that and sort of increasing frustration in terms of interactions with people who hold those views, I'm thinking this is not a particularly healthy combination. And I think you've got to be all in. Now, I could have stayed on as the MP for Bay of Plenty and not sat on a front bench, but I feel that you're actually not doing the job a servant. I think if you've reached that point where you are finding elements of the job frustrating, then I think just staying around to experience the good stuff and just sort of middling along, I don't think that's right for the Bay of Plenty or a community like this. This is a big city, right? It needs a senior minister sitting around a table. And if it's not going to be me, then I need to make way for somebody else who in time can do that. And that's important. It's been quite a journey, as I'm sure it has for you, right? Once you have experienced it, it does change your life perspective around what's important to you and how to manage yourself through to avoid it happening again.
Yeah, that was what I was going to ask next. Actually, was it's obviously something you would never choose to happen or go through, but as we discussed, these things do happen, right? Mm-hmm. And you can. I listened to your kind of language earlier on. I've got to sit with that for the rest of my life. But you stepped up and you gave it a go. Mm. You showed leadership in stepping up. Mm. You showed leadership in stepping down. Mm. There's value in that period of your life that will stay with you for the rest of your life. Mm. You might have the naysayers and the negative side of things that but what can you take from a positive point of view? What positives can you take out of that period that have shaped who you are now, and maybe from a leadership point of view, because we started off this conversation talking about leadership's everywhere. We can demonstrate in leadership in all aspects of life. What have you learned that shaped you differently, or shaped you as a leader differently?
I think it's learning, and it's gratitude, right? So when I referenced before elements of the transition between Simon as a leader to me as a leader and having to live with that, what I was trying to articulate is the fact that you own what you did, right? You own the experience, and it's important not to try and have a revisionist view that somehow suggests that you were not a contributor to what was a pretty tough period in the National Party's history. I was. But it is important that it doesn't sit with you in a sense of a negative regret. Do I regret the fact that I had mental health issues? Of course I do. Who wouldn't not want to have gone through the fire? But the thing is that I did. And so for me, the way I intend to live the rest of my life is to have gratitude about the fact that I have fantastic, loving family and friends, and even though it was a hideous experience, I know that has had a positive impact on other people, because the very media that I was attacking before, social media, allows an intimacy with individuals that and connectedness that just doesn't exist normally, right? So I have hundreds of messages on my phone from people who I don't know, who just got online and messaged me with thanks about being so open and then telling me their own story. Hundreds and hundreds of them. I don't know these people. Most of them would preface with, I vote Labour, but da 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 da. And so you realise actually, I have been through the fire, but there's a lot to be thankful for, and it has changed me as a person. I think I am more empathetic. I always thought I was empathetic, but it's like anything, right? You don't truly understand unless you've lived it. It's not a criticism. It's just now when you meet people that have had challenges in terms of, and are having challenges in terms of mental health, there's a relatability and an understanding and a connection that otherwise wouldn't have been there. And that's a powerful thing, to have that, be able to have those connections with people, and in a small way, maybe, assist in being someone that they feel that they can talk to about. So it's absolutely changed my life, and bizarrely in a good way. And, you're talking legacy, right? It's not for me to define it, but I suspect it'll be more related to this experience than any other thing that I did in the 9 years that I was there. And that's pretty powerful.
Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. What do you think you might do with it? This is probably the question that a lot of people have got about what's next for Todd. You're still a young bloke. You've got
great. Great. That's what I want to hear.
You've got a lot of experience that you can draw on. What do you think you might like to do with it? Have you got any thoughts or ideas about what the future holds?
No, I don't. And most, when I tell people that, they think, oh, yeah, come on, you've surely got some big job lined up in the corner. I don't actually. I am having a period of reflection as to what next. It's a big transition for me, right? Because I don't have a North Star anymore. The North Star was this, and I'm choosing to step away from this. So what is next? What does next look like? And I think for me, I have to sort of go back to the elements of sort of what has given my life purpose and meaning, and it is community and connection and service and agriculture and exports. And so, what in that space could emerge, and I would like to continue to support, mental health conversations more broadly. But I'm conscious of the fact that I am just one of hundreds of thousands. Yes, someone who was pretty public, but lots of us are going through this journey. And so if there is a way to assist in that context, then I'm open to it. But I suspect it's more likely to be in the space of what we're doing here, is that honest conversations with people that ask, as opposed to any sort of determined or deliberate role. But, we'll see. I love the city. I love the community. I want to stay a part of it. I don't see myself, disappearing and living somewhere else for the rest of my life. But you do want a role of, everyone wants meaning, right? They want purpose. They want a sense of what they're doing is valuable, is valued, and is valuable. And, I will now reflect on what best that could look like.
Your North Star of politics, is there a big enough difference between national politics and local politics that you might consider? I'm just conscious of the fact that, hopefully Tauranga's going to have a council again next year. And
hopefully.
We'll need a mayor. Is that something that you would consider, or is politics kind of off the table now?
I think it's off the table. It's absolutely not something that I would consider next year, categorically. You never say never, but in some ways, I think I would find, putting aside the fact that from a sort of energy perspective, I think, politics it's run its course. I also think local government is particularly challenging as a political career choice. Because unlike central government, when you do have power, when your ship comes in, so to speak, and you're in government for a period of time, and local government every day is, an arm wrestle with 11 others to try and get a consistent view as to how to deal with a $4 billion plus balance sheet. And our city for the last 30 years, I think, has been challenged to get that balance right. Okay, and I don't in any way dismiss those who have contributed huge amount of their time and hours and life in that space, but it's very difficult. And now we find ourselves a city of 170,000 people, and frankly up against it, because when you skip a generation in infrastructure and investment, it is very, very difficult to catch up again, because you're going to just naturally lean on the current ratepayers to front more than otherwise would be the case, and that's a very difficult ask. And then you're one of 12 or one of 10, whatever the number is. That's pretty difficult, And you look, the commissioners have had success. Not universally supported, but they've had success because it's 4 of them appointed to get in a room, agree it, and get on with it. Well, that's it's not democracy, but it's an efficient organisational design if you want to get stuff done. Democracy is very different, and so you have 10, 12 people with different views and perspectives and experiences and frankly capability in charge of $4 billion. So not for me, certainly not in the short term.
Well, whatever you decide to do, wish you all the very best with
Thanks,
that, with the taking time out and reflection and whatever comes next for you. Wish you all the best for that. I'd like to thank you so much for, again, taking time out of your busy schedule and spending time with us today to tell us a bit about your whole story, not just the bit that people have focused on in recent times.
Yeah.
I think the whole story is fascinating, and what drove you to get into politics, I think, there's some great lessons there for young people listening who want, not necessarily about politics, but whatever it is, having a bit of a focus and deciding what you want to do, and then that serendipitous kind of stuff that I found interesting because I've experienced that myself. Whether it's serendipity or whether it's you putting stuff out there and seeing things that you wouldn't see if you weren't of that mindset, I'm not sure, but
or a bit of both.
Or a bit of both, yeah, absolutely. But I think it's important for people to have a little bit of a focus around what they would like, and then things would start to fall in place for them. So that part of your story I found fascinating. So thank you for sharing all of it. I'm grateful for that. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for the opportunity.
Cheers.
All the very best.
Thanks, mate. As you'll hopefully know by now, if you've seen other episodes, this segment of the podcast is all about wisdom worth sharing from our guests who've been living a life that is a story worth retelling. At the end of every interview, I look back as part of the editing process and discover some of the gems that came out during the conversation and summarise them here. I'm grateful for Todd sharing his experience with mental health issues. It's important for public figures to be willing to open up about such matters, because clearly this creates opportunities for those of us who are less well known to also engage in such topics. Todd gave a good account of that in this interview, as he has done on other occasions, and he said he'll continue to do so. I've given a lot of thought to this particular story, and I'm considering creating a separate publication on those thoughts, so I won't go over Todd's mental health story here again, as there are other gems of wisdom worth sharing from the conversation. I love the part of Todd's story where he spoke about serendipity, the occurrence and development of events by chance in a happy or beneficial way. I'm sure that you will have experienced this too, when things seem to just happen for some reason, but you can't explain how or why. In Todd's story, he described how things fell into place for him with regard to getting into politics. After reading about American presidents as a child, he wrote a story about himself becoming the president, and that was the start of it. And then there were many other seemingly unfathomable events that led to him as a young man working closely with the Prime Minister for 3 years. Of course, ultimately, events would take Todd into politics as an MP, and then he became leader of the opposition, which could have resulted in him being the Prime Minister himself. What a fantastic story that would have been. This story resonated with me because I've had similar experiences of serendipity myself on a number of occasions, and coincidentally, when I was considering getting into politics many years ago. But what is it? Maybe it's something mystical, universe aligning things, or maybe it's less complex than that, but maybe equally mystical. I personally believe that we create serendipitous events ourselves. When we put our minds to something and we want it badly enough, we start to see opportunities in front of us that maybe we wouldn't have seen if we weren't in that state of mind. This may be taking a different take on confirmation bias. It helps us seize things that we've got an interest in. Our senses are working full time, all the time. So imagine how many things that we see but we do not observe, to quote Sherlock Holmes. It's a bit like when we're buying a new car. You can decide you maybe want a Mini Cooper, and suddenly now you see Mini Coopers all over the place. They were all there before, we just didn't register them because, like so many things we see, they're not that important to us. So we take little notice. In my situation, I'd never met a politician before, and once I decided that was of interest to me, they were everywhere. So what can we learn from this part of Todd's story? Well, I think two things. One is that, very simply, we need to know what it is that's important to us, what we want to focus on, and do so consciously. Because then we give ourselves the best chance of observing the things that could benefit us. If we aren't conscious of it, who knows what we will miss? The second is building on the first, and that is to make sure that when we see or observe these opportunities, we must grab them and do something. My favorite interpretation of luck is preparation meeting opportunity. We must know what we are wanting and be prepared for it, then see the opportunity and take it. Some call it luck, and some call it serendipity. Another point that Todd raised that resonated with me, as I'd been told to do the same when I was about 18, wanting to join the police force, was to go get some real life experience. Todd didn't need advising of this, he knew it himself, that the best way he could serve the needs of his future constituents was by obtaining worldly experience. He feels that today there are too many young politicians who haven't experienced much life outside of the political realm. And this makes sense to me. I think it's wisdom in action. We don't actually realize when we are young how limited our understanding of the world is. I can remember being a young man myself, thinking I knew all that there was to know, but not understanding why others thought less of me. I know why now, and that's because I'm old. It's not that young people aren't intelligent and can't achieve. Far from it, of course they can. But how can we expect to make the best decisions, such as in politics, on behalf of so many others with limited knowledge about how things work in the real world? Todd talked about leadership, having experienced many leadership roles in his career. Working with leaders in a coaching and education capacity, I liked what he had to say about this. He's pleased that the narrative around leadership is changing from the leader knows best to I need great people around me who know more than I do. Todd's worked for the likes of Zespri and Fonterra, two of New Zealand's leading organisations. He certainly experienced the opportunity to operate that way as a leader. It would have been interesting to have seen how Todd's leadership style played out in politics had he have remained leader of the National Party for some time. When we talked about politics, Todd said that he had concerns over where things are heading. And that reflects, I think, the feelings of so many people, many that I've spoken with or I've heard speaking on the matter, and myself included. Todd said that New Zealand is a vastly different place to what it was 15 years ago, and he's worried about where that's leading us. He said, we seem to be becoming more strongly partisan, and that people feel like if you don't vote for the same party as me, I can't have you round for dinner. That doesn't feel like things getting better to me. Feels like we're less than united. Feels like we're getting worse. Some will argue that we need to get worse before it gets better, but what happens if they're wrong and we're heading down a path of no return? I've been fortunate enough to have interviewed a few politicians on Life's Work podcast, and all of them saying kind of the same things, that they're worried about how people are behaving towards them and that the level of hatred in society is concerning. I spoke with Todd about this, and he felt that politicians and mainstream media were playing a significant role in this, that they were using social media to do it. He said that the behaviour towards people like Jacinda Ardern was appalling. Now, this isn't a lecture by me on the freedom of speech. I'm not suggesting that we stop expressing views and opinions about stuff, but I think it's how we're doing it that matters. If politicians can use social media to say what they like, how they like, then surely they're leading the way as far as the general public is concerned. It's causing some, like Todd, to rethink their careers. Why subject yourself and your families to that kind of behaviour when you can go do something else? As a general public, we need to be mindful of the outcomes we'll experience down the line, the cause and effect of this. We need decent, upstanding members of society to represent us at all levels, including at the parliamentary level. But if good people feel that they're left with no alternative but to step down due to the poor behaviour of others, what state will our parliament be in, and what state will our society be in the not too distant future? Hopefully you've been able to take many insights from this interview that you can apply to your own life, work and legacy. Use it, share it. As I always say, sharing is like teaching, and teaching helps us retain what we've learned and commit to change, which is absolutely necessary if we are to enhance our own life's work. I hope you're happy, safe and successful in all that you do. And remember, live a life that's a story worth retelling. I'm Steve Worsley, and I look forward to seeing you next time on Life's Work, the podcast all about wisdom worth sharing.